Okay, everybody. Well,
Welcome
to the final session roundtable of this conference. First of all, I would like to thank you for still being here on a Saturday afternoon. So, well done. Thank you very much. I also want to thank all the organizers of this remarkable conference. I think this is the third time I come. It's getting better and better in my experience. I think I've always found it incredibly useful. So please, give it up, especially for Ulrike and all the people, and especially for all the people who are doing a lot of the organizational work in the background. It's been a tremendous 2 days, and I think we can all agree on that. Now, in this final session, we're going to run a slightly different format, in the sense that this is a conference which is very much aimed at a particular public, you, and we want that public to be present at the final roundtable. So, for that purpose, we've mixed experience and youth, we've mixed enthusiasm and wisdom. Not necessarily what you expect it. So we have 4 people on this panel, and I would like to introduce them, starting from my left. So Norah, who is, I think, possibly one of the most vocal exponents of the concept of protection, and certainly one of the most critical person to engage with the concept of protection. Is based on their experience with the UN system, on a quest to establish human rights in the UN system, I think, and to be the passionaria of protection. So I'm really glad she's on the panel. I think she's a remarkable advocate and a critical one too. I'd like to now. I've cheated a bit. I've invited 2 of my own students because, on the ground that the students you know better than the students you don't. So they're both medical students, and they're in their 5th year. They're very much like many of you. They did a project with me last year. Both of them, I think, are remarkably bright and intelligent and fantastically articulate, and they'll have to live up to that in a minute. And in fact, one of them presented during this conference. So I will start with you, Stephanie. So Stephanie Cachelin and Jonathan Holden, who's putting his label the right way up. Okay. Both of them have actually just done perhaps a little bit more reading than you, or some of you, in the field, but not much more than you. They've been here in this conference, and it is because they are of the conference that we ask them to ask questions to our guest speakers. And the final speaker is Andreas Wigger, who is a voice of the ICRC and has been working for the ICRC for 30 years in a variety of roles, but in his final position was working for the protection division at the ICRC headquarters. So fantastic. So we have 2 experienced people who are incredibly well placed to talk about protection. And me, personally, well, I'm a historian, so I'm just here to watch the show, really. But I'm going to, and then write about it in scathing terms, as one does later on. But no, the format we're going to have is essentially this. We're going to start with a range of questions coming from our student participants of the conference. I'm going to give them a chance to respond, and then we will move on to ask, so that you can ask your questions according to the same format. So we hope that we're not going to exhaust the entire conversation, but it is meant to be a conversation on the fundamental question of this conference, essentially, protection. Is it a broken promise? So I'm turning to my students, and I give them a microphone each, and ask. Okay?
Yep. Thank you. So we've both really enjoyed the conference and thought it was really good, and we were asked to kind of come up with a summary, so I'm doing half and Jonathan's doing the other half. So the first themes that we got were the protection from what? And we've seen examples of the protection from violence. We've heard about Syria, Sri Lanka, CAR, amongst others. The loss of infrastructure, community and identity for IDPs, and the health threats, the emerging Ebola, antimicrobial resistance, and also the denial of basic human rights. So I've kind of got that as the theme of this is what we are trying to protect people from?
Fair enough.
In my thinking, I've looked more at how we intend to provide protection and what that means. It's clearly a multifaceted, complex issue. I think everyone's agreed on that. In terms of decreased access, increased humanitarian need, and the increase in number of actors adds to this complexity. We heard from General Dallaire on the first day, who talked of the role of military and peacekeeping troops and whether or not they can provide some sort of protection. We've also heard extensively from NGOs, from the ICRC, and we've heard their stance and the measures that they have taken and are taking to provide protection. And lastly, I would say that we've looked at the challenges we face in the future. The complexity of interagency cooperation, the timing and the scaling of responses. And I'd say there seems to be consensus that I've heard that humanitarians can't solve these problems, but that they certainly have a crucial role in holding those to account who can.
So I'll start with the first question that we've discussed, and it comes from the title, Protection, a Broken Promise. And what we wanted to know is, was there a promise? And if so, was it broken?
Okay. So, Norah?
Well, first of all, thanks. These are great questions. And without having much time to think about it, and the whole idea is that, we're going to use the last 2 days and the different comments that came in the different sessions to enhance our own understanding of where we're at. And the questions are interconnected, which is good. Protection from what, Stephanie asked, and what do we mean by protection? Maybe I will start with the second question first. What do we mean by protection? Because there is a certain amount of confusion about it. In my own work, the way I've broken it down in more recent times, and to facilitate maybe the discussion here, is, there's a whole gamut of threats that put lives at risk, and which of them, is it absence of food and water, or the lack of immunization services, does that contribute to protection problems? Maybe. So basically, as I understand protection, the way we've discussed it over this past 2 days is what are threats of a non-material that produce non-material needs? In other words, are these threats as a result of violence, physical violence, armed violence? Is it threats as a result of assault on our dignity and the dignity of people affected by crises and disasters? Or are they threats resulting from discrimination? So in my own understanding of it as a practitioner, which is what I have been for most of my life, primarily in the humanitarian world, but also in the human rights world, the way I've broken it down, whether I'm working in Liberia or Sri Lanka or Afghanistan, and for the purpose of this discussion, I've broken it down to 3 R's. The first R is risk reduction. What do we do to reduce the nature of the threat? Is it, for example, better lighting, better designed camps for refugees or IDPs? Is it, mapping of where the landmines are so that people have greater freedom, safety of movement? So that's one R. The next R, which is actually most common from the point of view of humanitarian workers, average humanitarian worker, is remedial action. One example is psychosocial counseling, helping survivors of rape to rebuild their lives. And then the third R, respect for norms. How do we, and as we know, we're operating in a world where the nature of armed conflict is changing, especially in terms of asymmetrical warfare. And the rules, Andreas will talk to them, that came into being 150 years ago are obviously still valid, but the way in which we can get them applied will very much depend on our operating environment. So the third R then is how to mobilize respect for our core humanitarian norms. In other words, how to safeguard the distinction between who is a combatant and who is a civilian. So that, maybe I should stop there, not to take up too much time. So to put on the table, my understanding as a framework for the rest of the discussion is what is protection and how do we go about addressing it?
Yes, thanks also for these excellent questions. In my opinion, if we are asking a broken promise, yes, it is a broken promise by many actors who committed themselves to act correctly when it comes to war. And I'm referring to the Geneva Convention. This is the international humanitarian law. That's a body of law that is ratified by virtually every state on the world. This is the most ratified body of law. And theoretically, I mean, they have really, the governments, the armies, the security sector, the police, they have committed themselves to behave correctly when it comes to war, notably, as Norah said, to have this kind of notion of distinction. The civilian is a civilian, and combatants are combatants. So I think if the ICRC, I mean, our approach, and I don't want to make this debate an ICRC debate, but I just want to say that we are, when we speak of protection, we mean to have conversations, endless conversations, numerous conversations with all kinds of people about their commitments. Even non-state actors, normally, they commit at a certain time in a conflict, they commit to certain rules, but you have to remind them. And I think it's a great communication act. It is also, I believe that it brings really also the cultures together. I'm not in favor of having people from one culture only speaking to their own people. But I think if we have these expatriates and also, I mean, from wherever on the world, you go to Iraq and you have an intelligent, hard talk with people who are in power and who have also the means to change. And then you have just to be creative to an extent that it is really, this is the genius of, I think, of a humanitarian worker, that he has to be creative and think, okay, how can I make this institution, this man, this person, this woman change a little bit? He's now maybe really totally on the wrong path. How is that possible? And I think that is the, and to notably remind them of their broken promise. So if we speak today of providing protection, it is slightly, it gives the impression that we are coming in and provide protection. In my opinion, this is one aspect. I would plead that we have more faith in this local reminder and make people protect them, their communities and their people.
Thank you very much. Second question?
You mentioned about coming in and providing protection. Again, I'm reminded of what General Dallaire talked about, how if you were to bring in tens of thousands of troops at the right time, that could actually help prevent a lot of what happens. And I just wonder what your opinion is on peacekeeping campaigns, whether or not they do work or have worked. That's my second question.
Okay. Norah. More soldiers. Is that what you want?
Okay, well, I'll say two things then. You know, the bulk of the conference has been about the core of the conference, of course, is what do we as humanitarians with our humanitarian's hat? And I mentioned earlier that I've been both working as a humanitarian and as human rights. So with my humanitarian hat, I make a distinction between what we do as humanitarians and what we do as peace mediators, what we do as peace enforcement missions, what we do as human rights activists, or what do we do is trying to get accountability and bring perpetrators to the International Criminal Court. So in other words, I need to put this on the table. I'm an old-style donantist type of humanitarian. In other words, sticking close to the ICRC view of the world that, of course, a number of organizations share. So then in terms of is there a role for armed protection? Absolutely. I have worked in Cambodia, and before that, on the Thai-Cambodian border. This is back in 1980 when I started out by accident as a humanitarian because I was actually en route to Uganda to do what I thought was my development work. And here, you know, of course, in the border camps, closed border camps, which have echoes of Sri Lanka 2009 that we discussed yesterday, were the survivors of genocide. And they were survivors of genocide in part because the Vietnamese army had come in and pushed out the Khmer Rouge. So where I have... Yeah, in my experience, there is a role for military interventions If I move quickly forward over this past 2 to 3 decades then, and of course in 2005 we had or what's called R2P, responsibility to protect. And I guess one example of its use, although it can be disputed, was Libya. You know, was it about regime change, or was it really about protecting the lives of Libyans? And did that intervention in 2011 deliver? Again, I guess there'd be lots of perspectives on that, but clearly Libya is not at peace, and the need for protection from different sources of threat, diverse sources of threat, persists. So Jonathan's questions was, what are our views? I have to go back to the question on the use of troops. Yeah, so I guess my answer in part, if I haven't made it clear enough, is that on occasion it appears that there is, unfortunately, a need for military armed intervention. Of course, how that is done and under what type, I hate using the mandate word, but whether it's come out of an international rule-based system such as the Security Council, then I think it makes it more legitimate. But clearly, how the use of military forces is used and is perceived has huge implications for what humanitarians can do. So to me, it's yeah.
When you talk about Cambodia, there were not only victims of the genocide in those camps, there were also perpetrators. Does that change the picture?
Yeah. I didn't know if I want to go into, because it's not about the role of military. Okay, when people got pushed out, you may in the room, because you weren't born then, but you may have images of the end of the Vietnam War, and then very quickly, the war that was already existing in Cambodia, I can't say took off, but intensified. And in 1975, the Khmer Rouge, young people with guns, and very brutalized by the war, and with a very strong ideology, marched into the capital, Phnom Penh, and their first move was to insist that the civilian population that had crowded into the city as the war moved in towards the capital, so they emptied the capital, and then, ask any Cambodians, and for 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, if I got these figures correct, but that's about the time, it was less than 4 years, genocide occurred. And then the survivors of genocide, including with the Khmer Rouge, were pushed out of the border, escaped into Thailand at the end of 1978, the very end of 1978. And they were on the Cambodian side or straddling it for a few years, but then by the time I arrived in end of 1986, they were in closed camps. And some of these, all of the camps were dominated by there were 3 different political/military actors, and one of the camps that I worked in, Site 8, was a Khmer Rouge camp. So it was indeed, as Bertrand said, both. So what one can do in terms of helping people survive, helping the survivors of genocide survive in a setting where, and of course this was the Cold War, where the survivors, and it's got some echoes of what happened at the end of the genocide in Rwanda, where survivors are mixed in with perpetrators, obviously throws up some very difficult protection issues. The way that story finished, moving forward rapidly, was 12, 13 years later, after the Paris Peace Accords, the camps were dismantled, and people, including the remnants of the Khmer Rouge, went back to Cambodia. And then, I guess it was about a month ago, some of the trials that were initiated slowly, but came into being X years after the genocide was over, have put, I don't know if the verdict is still out, but yeah. Now there's a process, very, very late, but nonetheless it's happening, of a number of the perpetrators being put on trial.
Thank you very much. But I think that shows the complexity of the protection debate when you're talking about there aren't any easy solutions. You cannot separate necessarily perpetrators from victims in those contexts. Andreas, do you want to respond?
Yes, I think it was said yesterday and today also in various panels that military intervention should also always be in a wider, really in a wider political solution set up, and not just immediately and jump in. We were not really speaking, for instance, of sanction regimes. Sanction regimes are today used also to make government change, or the threat of ICC, International Criminal Court. There are other means also to influence. But of course, in extreme situations, as the general mentioned in his keynote speech, Rwanda or others, then you have probably to send in troops. But this is not up to the humanitarians. This is really up to New York Security Council. And voila, that is... by the way, this is also according to Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions. All the parties are obliged to make sure that other parties are complying with these conventions in whatever form. But I was interested yesterday also to listen to the debate about the efficacy and the efficiency of peacekeeping. I think the debate showed that it is, if a peace is there, to keep the peace. Okay, that is obviously. But we were speaking of a robust peacekeeping, of peace enforcement mission. I mean, all kind of adjectives were lately added to that. And I'm personally a little bit pessimistic because you are going in very delicate local dynamics, and Libya has shown that this is a total disaster. Where is Libya today? And who is accountable today also for the many victims that are today in Libya? So maybe the responsibility of the international community the international community has maybe also a short memory in such areas.
Stephanie?
Sorry, can I just add one word to the Cambodian story? Because from the protection viewpoint, no, because I missed out on it and I shouldn't have done that. I mean, the Cambodians were survivors of genocide, and I talked about them being in closed camps, which means they were not allowed to seek asylum. So they were kept there for political reasons, and the word we have used since is, those survivors of genocide were instrumentalized with the help, whether we like it to acknowledge it or not, mostly we don't, of us humanitarians. And that, of course, was a rude awakening for many of us. And one last thing, where I did learn then the importance that humanitarian action can't just be about food, water, and well-organized camps, which was definitely the story on the Thai-Cambodian border. It was well-funded and well-supported and well-managed. I was told, and brought up short one day when I was told, we Cambodians are not chickens in a cage. And it was a good reminder to me that indeed protection, the term the way we use it is that the ability of people to have some dignity and have some control and decisions in their own life is to me the essence of protection.
Thank you very much.
You've also mentioned kind of diverse sources of threat. You've mentioned water, lack of vaccines and things. And I'm wondering what, to you, the biggest threat to life is at the moment. And then bearing in mind the speech you had this morning about kind of the need for an evidence base, what evidence there is out there of the various sources of threat.
Congratulations. I think, can you bring the champagne this way? Oh, that. All right. So, yeah, okay.
Okay, I don't know if you wanted me to start every time, Bertrand, but okay, what is the biggest threat to life? Big question, very, very important question, Stephanie, thanks. It will vary from crisis to crisis. If we're looking at this question, of course, from what are the biggest protection challenges? Clearly, the more difficult places are where we have unrestricted warfare, where unrestricted warfare is the tactic used by authorities, whether that is the state or those opposing them. So in other words, whether it's the Syrian government or non-state armed actors who have control over a population or over a territory, when their approach to achieving their political or military objectives is to maximize the suffering of a people, from my perspective and experience, is what throws up the biggest challenge. Now, if I move to the Philippines and the typhoon of about a year ago, there will be a different type of protection challenge, perhaps obviously less contentious, because in other words, to illustrate the point, in settings where, or like in Pakistan after the floods, massive floods, 2010, in a situation where people and authorities are pulling together in the same direction, there will often be issues, because we human beings, when we're in communities, the more powerful will rise to the top or whatever, but they tend to be less difficult to address in those kind of settings where, in other words, the society is not divided, where after an earthquake in Haiti, maybe Haiti's not such a good example because there were such big problems there before, but the point I'm trying to make is in a setting where it's not just armed conflict, it is where society is divided. And we've heard lots of discussions over this past few days about the importance of being impartial and being neutral, so that we humanitarians, whatever badges we're wearing or T-shirts or logos, that we are able to cross lines, we are able to work with communities to help them optimize their own coping mechanisms to stay safe, to keep their kids safe, etc., etc. So maybe I should stop there at the biggest threat to life, because I'm sure Andreas wants to talk about asymmetrical warfare and what that means in terms of challenges to humanitarian law. So I won't go there, sorry.
Andreas, would you like to talk about asymmetrical warfare?
I thought, but now I think definitely... No, I think it's a very difficult question, and it should probably be an evidence-based response, and I have not an evidence-based response. And maybe I just give a few, from a few angles. But if we look at we were speaking a lot in the last couple of years on the shrinking humanitarian space. And in my interpretation is, I'm coming back to this conversation, the shrinking space for having good conversations on obligations when it comes to conflict. I have the impression that we have today also maybe an overkill of adversity of conflicts. And we are not believing into the concept of the Geneva Conventions that, okay, conflicts happen. I mean, that's human mankind and so on. But let us have at least a kind of basic commitment to follow a few rules. And to have this, I think this is very difficult today to often discuss, because you are immediately, okay, no, we should prevent conflicts. Of course, we should prevent conflicts in the ideal world. But I think to have very intelligent conversations on conduct of hostilities, what is military necessity, and to go into this with people who have concrete and very pragmatic questions, because they are confronted with that. So I guess this is one, and the other is, in my opinion, a kind of adversity in many parts of the world against international thing, a universal thing. And this, in my opinion, is a regression, because it will be more a kind of community, more closed communities, and this kind of conversation is not anymore possible. And I fear that is something really damaging the whole approach.
Can we define what evidence-based would apply to protection? Because I think is protection demonstrated in the breach rather than in the effective delivery? In other words, is it easier to actually demonstrate the absence of protection than to demonstrate the effectiveness of protection? That's one small question. But the second one is also, this conference very interestingly mixed, of course, the medical concerns, and especially things like biosecurity issues, but largely because Ebola is with us. And I wondered if protection actually covers biosecurity issues. So, two small questions. Who wants to answer that one? Either of them.
Okay, evidence, a huge discussion, and we had some interesting conversations over this past few days. And I think it'll be a key future going forward for a number of reasons, that over time we have learned the importance of understanding what is the scope of the problem, what is the nature of the problem, what are its dynamics, in order, if we're going to be able to identify what are the priority issues, what are the threats that are putting lives most at risk. That's using evidence in a broad term. And Bertrand asked, it's relatively easy to document the absence of protection, yes and no, depending on the situation. So what I wanted to say, yeah, I think evidence is important for indeed being able to understand what is the nature of the threat, what are the coping mechanisms, what are communities doing to safeguard the lives of the community and family members and families within it, or particular groups. And it would, in principle, evidence also helps us then allocate resources in a way that is done in a humanitarian fashion. In other words, we allocate resources to the threats that puts the most lives at risk. I think what is changing, Bertrand, to answer your question, evidence of useful outcomes, thank goodness we've moved beyond, I think, or we're moving beyond seeing protection as just a complicated term that we use every which way, to be more focused on, well, what are protective outcomes? And there's been some interesting work. I don't know where Ginny is in the audience. Interaction have been busy, and the agencies that are part of that, and others, to develop the tools so that we're better able to put in place strategies that are focused on bringing about protective outcomes. And what do I mean by that? And maybe at a certain point we're going to open the floor to the room, so there's much more examples coming from the other side of the table. We are not good right now, is my general understanding, having been involved in a different small research project about a year ago, in ascertaining are the results of our work actually leading to protective outcomes. I say we have made some improvement, and the example, unfortunately, that comes to mind, the only one that readily comes to mind, but maybe Ginny can help me, is, for example, when an effort was made starting in 2007, early 2008 in Afghanistan, to systematically track the incidents involving reported civilian casualties, and then, of course, the investigation determined whether or not civilians had been killed or harmed in other ways, and then using that evidence, so quite often this work is described as monitoring and reporting, but it wasn't that. It was using that evidence to then have a dialogue or a discussion with both sets of warring parties, in other words, ISAF and the government on the one side, and the armed opposition on the other. And having that discussion to push for changes in attitudes, policies, and practices that reduced the use of unrestricted warfare and its impact on civilians. And that included then, in terms of outcomes, reduced use of airstrikes in residential areas, and on the other side of the equation, reduced use of IEDs in villages. And we had evidence to document that. Obviously, it didn't work as good as it should work, but the point is it is possible to track and measure and push for and achieve outcomes that reduce risks.
Okay, that's very good. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, not particularly. I think the example Norah just gave from Afghanistan is perfect illustration. Let's
move on to the next question. Nobody's answering on biosecurity?
No, but sorry. You want to do that, Andreas? He means like Ebola. I don't know why he's using this rich word.
Well, I think there should be maybe somebody from MSF
we'll leave that
commenting on that.
So if somebody feels like answering that question, please hold on for a minute or two, and we'll move on to your question.
A couple more questions, or
no? Just one more question, and then we'll move on to open up.
Okay, so for a last question, my last question would be looking towards the future. I think it was in an address this morning, somebody said there's 40,000 NGOs. And in an increasingly complex humanitarian aid sphere, some choose to collaborate, to cooperate. Is there a future possible where NGOs merge, unify, become more unified in addressing the issues today, or is the variety and different in identities key to them addressing the future?
An easy question, Stephanie. One last one as well.
Yeah, it was something that we've kind of discussed about the increasing insecurity, and we were wondering, is there an increasing insecurity?
Okay, so there you go. Bright future for unified humanitarian response, Norah?
Okay, let me try to put this based on my own experience. There's always richness in diversity, point number one. Point number two, the bulk of the work to survive in a crisis situation is done by the people directly affected. So we really need to keep that in mind. So if that's the case, then coming in I can't even though envisage it, one mammoth agency, I can't see how it would operate, because you would still have to be able to relate to different types of communities, different types of problems. So, however, Jonathan's question, I think, is also about, listening, I think, to General Dallaire, are we better able to be complementary? Are we better able to, because clearly, from all the agencies I know, no one agency is able to address all the kind of issues that put communities in danger, or that endangered communities are confronted with. So I think there is definitely a need, I would argue, but not everybody would agree with me, for greater complementarity. Jonathan, I think, was also asking, or maybe you didn't ask, how's the future like? So shall we leave it there? Shall I also talk about increasing insecurity?
I'll ask that
from
okay. Andreas.
Okay.
You know, we used to have one big NGO that did everything. It was called UNRWA after the Second World War, and it was a failure. So it's interesting.
It's not an NGO.
What is an NGO?
Well, it was a state organization, the United Nations Rescue and Rehabilitation.
Okay.
It wasn't an NGO.
Well, for the United Humanitarian Organization, no, coming from the ICRC, I'm pleading for more diversity, but complementarity. I think when we are speaking, for instance, of protection, we were not mentioning, for instance, Human Rights Watch for the last 2 days, or OHCHR. But for me, for instance, for us, Human Rights Watch has developed a fantastic capacity to document conduct of hostilities, and they do very good reports. And then they also give good recommendations to the Security Council. So this is a perfect complementary approach to what we do as ICRC, for instance, on the ground. We cannot go immediately and accuse people. But I think we should have more such very competent complementary organizations. And frankly speaking, we have already too much one thing in the humanitarian world. So I plead for more diversity, so that we also collectively, I mean, we were speaking of learning organizations and so on. I think we learn only if there is some competition, not competition in the bad way, but at least a little bit diversity. Otherwise, we are told how to think and then and how to act, and this is, I think, not very good. Because it's also context specific. We have to take the context also very, that is my opinion.
Okay. Thank you very much to our panelists. So we've done our little bit. Thank you very much to our two students who I think have started this well. Now it's your turn. So can you please raise your hands proudly in the air? There's one person over there. Students are particularly welcome to ask questions, but it doesn't stop you.
I'm a student of this panel. So I wanted to pick up on an issue that I don't think has been identified explicitly over the past couple of days as it relates to the potential positive effect and positive contribution of peacekeeping operations for protection. And that is, of course, UN-mandated peacekeeping missions are almost always overtly partisan. They are aligned with one party to conflict. And even if it's not a peacekeeping mission, for example, the NATO campaign in Libya was overtly aligned with one side and against another. What effect do you feel that this has for their prospects as an effective contributor for the protection of civilians in armed conflict? In my mind, it's a fallacy to expect them to have a positive contribution because of their partiality? Or am I sort of transplanting a humanitarian expectation for how things work and applying it to a peacekeeping realm and in fact, expecting them to behave in a way that isn't going to be necessary in order to have a positive outcome? My concern is also for, are they in fact potentially putting populations at risk when they are mandated and they insist on performing their tasks and therefore, coming into proximity with the population and, having a negative effect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we take the second question just behind?
I would also go about this point, closing reflection. I would give my reflection after participating in all this discussion. And when I read this protection, a broken compromise, I thought, after all these 2 days, is it not too ambitious? Protection, there are a lot of actors in protection, it is not only the humanitarian organizations. It's the politics, it's the military, it's a peace builder, it's the human rights organizations. And my conclusion is, should we not be where, look, what are we, with the limits which we have, should we not make the question other way around, protection, what can humanitarian organizations really do? And where are the limits? And therefore, we have also, within the organization, different possibilities. There is a big organizations like ICRC, who has more possibilities as a small organizations, but we should stand to our limitations and not to overcharge, as humanitarians, our possibilities of protection.
Okay, so 2 excellent questions. Who wants to respond first?
Ladies first. Well, maybe we just divide up. No, because I think if we divide up the questions, it might be just move more quickly so we can get more. So, Jenny, well, I think Jenny's was kind of less of a question, more of a comment. Or are you asking the panel, Jenny, what effect is it a fallacy that a partisan peace enforcement mission will actually also put people in danger? Is that how I understood the question?
I describe sort of my interpretation, but would you agree? Do you think that's correct, or should we indeed expect positive effects to arise from peacekeeping missions, even if they are partisan?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult to expect a positive outcome in a divided society, in a conflict setting where there are different sets of belligerents. And whether people like it or not, they're going to be associated because they're behind the lines or under the control of different sets of belligerents. So I think I agree that it's not very realistic to expect positive outcomes. I think the few examples that were presented yesterday as positive was East Timor. It was the only one I remember. And of course, East Timor, we may remember, I've never worked there, but the political leaders had a vision that they fought for in freeing their country from occupation, and the leaders that they had, I'm not going to pronounce their name correctly, so I won't even try, had a vision for their country and were legitimate in the sense that they had the support of the population, which of course is not the case in many other settings. So I don't know if East Timor UN peace operation was unique in that respect. I just don't have a big enough overview of the world.
Okay. No, I'm really not an expert on peacekeeping. I'm just personally, over the last 30 years, my observations that if there is a peace to keep, and often it's very helpful that you have a peacekeeper, for instance, in southern Lebanon. I was in 2006 in Lebanon when there was the war between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel started the war, and the peacekeepers, they just went out of their area of responsibility and waited till the end of the war, and then they went again in. I haven't seen any really preventive thing. I think it's important that peacekeepers are in areas and do their job, but I think one should not expect too much.
The second question, which was on whether correct me if I'm wrong, but whether humanitarian agencies are essentially too small to deliver the promise of protection. Yes, that's correct.
No, I think this is definitely right. I mean, we were not speaking of mandate, but with what authority are you, for instance, going as a small NGO to discuss with an army on their conduct facilities? There, we have a mandate. I mean, we are mentioned in the Geneva Conventions. We are also helping armies in normal peace times to implement these conventions into their national legislation, as Pierre Gentile, my colleague, explained yesterday. So we are permanently in contact. And so we have a kind of natural authority because we are known as experts on that. But I think if an NGO has no capacity, expertise, I think they should not go into such a field. They will be just ridiculous. It will be ridiculous if they want to speak about that. So we had today a very good panel on the Central African Republic, where we had quite easily good examples of MSF, MDM, Action Against Hunger projects and the contribution to their to protection. And of course, OCHA as an overall player, of course, in another field.
But sorry, maybe I just say to this, because I said at the outset there are different threats to peace. Sorry, there are different threats that produce protection issues. And I mentioned that I started out by accident on the Thai-Cambodian border, and people were locked into closed camps. I mean, so the very structure that was there was a danger for them, and it limited. Then I can go on, and they were locked in these camps. Kids were born in them, growing up in these camps. So I guess what I would also like to put on the table is that protection is somewhat like contentious and a bit marginalized, or is the orphan element of humanitarian work. But I think I would argue what we all need to bear in mind is that whether we like it or not, we're impacting on the safety and dignity of people if we're involved as humanitarians, either because we're linked up, joined at the hip with a military mission, whether because we're operating in closed camps. It also happened in Sri Lanka. So that's one point I want to say, that whether we like it or not, we're going to be impacting on it, either by doing nothing or by doing bad programming. That the way we go about then going on to the next step, like how we design camps, and these are camps that there's been a lot of discussion, examples of, people happened in Darfur, women had to go out and search for firewood, and in the process got raped and were subjected to other violations. So in other words, the way we go about designing programs will also have implications for the safety and dignity of people who are in distress. And then there's Andreas has covered, what can and cannot be done in the war zones. It's clear that humanitarians are not in a position to physically stop, stand in front of a house and stop an airstrike. However, we showed in Afghanistan that we were able to bring attention to the issue so that there was more restrictions on the use of airstrikes.
My name is Sabu and I'm from London. My question is from yesterday's presentation of Professor Nadaraja about Sri Lanka. We saw in the presentation yesterday that the issue of protection relating to this Tamil issue happened over a period of time, and also if you see the research paper of Norah, it also says that the people are marginalized from over a period of many decades. And my question is that if we see the case of Myanmar, are we looking to see this type of scenario and this type of thing happening after 30, 40 years, that some like Tamil Tigers or LTT will develop over there, and that same scenario will happen after 30, 40 years? Or, what can be done actually in relation to the Myanmar?
Burma, Myanmar.
Yeah.
Well, I can say two words. I mean, there's some similarities in that both are Buddhist-dominated countries. I didn't get your name, and I don't know how familiar you are to what humanitarians do. I mean, humanitarians and humanitarian work, humanitarian interventions, as under the hat of humanitarians, as MSFs or ICRCs or Oxfam or those kind of NGO organizations, it's not transformative. It is there to help people survive a crisis. Now, of course, in protracted settings, whether it's Sri Lanka or Afghanistan, etc., going over the decades of the division, armed conflict in society, how you go about helping people survive will evolve and change. But nonetheless, I don't see that humanitarians have the capacity or whatever to address the root causes of conflict. I do not understand that to be their role.
So I guess your point was, can we develop protection in a preventative sort of fashion? And I think you've got your answer. Do you want to go, Andreas?
Yeah, maybe just to this, we always say we may contribute. We may contribute to prevention, but it is not. It's difficult. We are again in this kind of difficulty to attribute exactly. But by the very presence for long years with all the kind of actors also, for instance, addressing issues like disappearance, which is often a very critical issue for communities and which may then also help to prevent further atrocities if you properly address it, if you also give the families the necessary support and so on. So I think there are a number of activities that may contribute, but it's not the main, that the activities are not planned in this way. It is just maybe a side effect, a positive side effect.
I guess we know the name of that one.
You can let Andreas go first.
I take the opportunity to speak because I still consider myself a student of peace. And that's your priority, I'm sure. I'm listening to all these comments regarding the interfacing, the protection with the peacekeeping forces, the NGOs, and the debate that we're still having, the humanitarian space, the neutrality, all fundamental elements that are still there plaguing us of trying to move from personality-driven capabilities in the field that are trying to collaborate, cooperate, coordinate, but rarely trying to integrate these different disciplines to synergize into solutions. And one of the elements that I feel is being articulated as an homogeneous entity, but is not, is the 110,000 peacekeepers that are out there and the 3 billion we spend a year that are of so often very inferior capabilities. So you're giving them mandates to protect, but absolutely no capability of reaching it. You can pour tens of thousands of troops, but they become a liability, just like many NGOs, the sort of mom and pop outfit that have a lot of goodwill, hit the ground and become a liability the minute they're there because they don't even have a pot to pee in. So all I'm trying to say is that when you're touching these things, do you not believe that we've got to be far more discerning in what the capability is out there, what the mandates we want them to do, and then how we can actually work more effectively, and which includes not putting all security into military, but in fact, a large part of the problem is the police side that is way, way deficient, I believe, in filling its role in many of these conflict zones. So I'm asking for a bémol to the sort of generic sort of description of what military and peacekeeping is.
Okay, that's very... it's worth noting that nobody or the UN is at the table, so they are not in a position to respond by increasing the resources of the peacekeeping. However, I'll give them a chance to pretend they are the UN, so go ahead.
No, I completely agree with the General. Let's take, for instance, the Kivus in DRC, and you have troops that are not speaking French. I mean, how do you want to communicate with people if you are from an English-speaking background, for instance? That was something that was striking me. And of course, then the troop contributing countries, they are what they are. So it's, I think it is again also a big international issues about resource allocation. It's out of the reach of a humanitarian organization, but I completely agree with your remarks.
Okay, if I can just, do you want me to? Yeah, okay, very quickly. Yeah, I also agree that, sending out a military mission, whatever is, whether it's Chapter 6 or Chapter 7, in other words, peace enforcement, or there is a peace to keep, if it doesn't have the resources and doesn't have the competence, it's going to find the task obviously that much more difficult. And we've seen, so maybe the point I really then want to add, General Dallaire, is that in Afghanistan it was a somewhat different situation, that the Taliban regime got routed very quickly at the end of 2001, and then there was a massive, I don't know if I can use the word investment, but there was a huge amount of resources, whether it was put into the political pot, in basically an effort of state building, and state building was and remains required. And there's lots of lessons, I think we've all agreed earlier, to be taken from Afghanistan, which is, of course, unique, but also has echoes elsewhere. So when talking about resources, though, I think we do have to bear in mind in Afghanistan, notwithstanding no shortage of resources, I don't know what were the number of billions that were put into it, that as the NATO troop drawdown now occurs towards the end of this year and early next year, I think about less than 10,000 will be left, that I have argued recently in a paper on democratization that in many ways, not in all ways, in many ways, Afghans are facing a more complicated situation now, 13 years later, than they did at the end of 2001, early 2002. In part, not only, of course, because the rule of law, the judiciary is the most despised institution. The police are not trusted. There is no legal recourse in the judicial system. And the political predatory elite are there thanks to our efforts to both squash the agenda of impunity and in the process we brought back, not just brought back, but empowered characters with a history of warlordism that has never been taken into account. So I agree resources are a huge issue, but it's also true, it seems, that when you have the resources, they need to be put to the best use of the people we say we want to help.
Thank you very much. Right, this is... Come on, one last question from the field? No? Antonio, you're not a student. Antonio Donini, please, over there. Yeah, okay, well, it's all right. We'll have another couple of questions from the students I carefully selected in advance.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting panel. But I was intrigued by something rather worrying that Andreas said about the aversion towards universality. And if he's right that there is an increasing challenging of our universal values, which happen to be the Western values anyway, and that at the same time we're encouraging, or we foresee the developing of 1,000 flowers in the humanitarian galaxy, what does this mean for principles? Are principles likely to be challenged by, versions of universality coming from Asia, from China, or from Latin America? How do you see this battle for, if we want to maintain our principles, playing out in the next decades?
So, Andreas, are you doomed like the Enlightenment?
No, but I mean, for me, I was for 4 years responsible within the ICRC to discuss with Islamist circles, also Islamist groups, and to have a conversation on their reaction on international humanitarian law and principles. And I made the experience that the beauty of the international humanitarian law is that it is not so controversial in terms of society. It's really, as I said, the basics for respect in conflict, for prisoners, for civil population, for the wounded. And I think in every culture one respects that. Basically, a prisoner should be well treated. Then we come to details, or a wounded should be treated. So I'm not so pessimistic about that. But the problem is that you really give the others a credit, and you always say, okay, it is the principles. It's not. One can also have other labels on the principles. One can also have other traditional narratives the principles are coming from. One has not to go out and say, well, this is now the achievement of the European 19th enlightening century, and this is the ultimate, the end of history, and there we are. So I think it brings in also a kind of course, one has to. I'm convinced that we can continue with that. But one has to have more conversations on that and to kind of see, okay, where is the anchorage in other cultures and make the effort and not take it for granted that impartiality is understood everywhere. No, I just wanted to say before that we have really to make an effort, and we have to have a conversation also with people who have maybe really at the beginning a little bit a kind of hesitancy, but it is important that there is a global conversation on that, and not just regional or a kind of clusters, and then you come up with a kind of Asian thing and an African thing and a Western thing. I mean, that I think it is dangerous.
Andreas, you've mentioned a few times kind of this need for conversation, and in an era of instant conversation and global connectedness, do you think humanitarian agencies are engaging enough with the new technologies and the kind of all the potential that holds? And also, is it ethical to not be innovating it and engaging with it fully?
Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting question. And we had long debates also in the elaboration of these professional standards, by the way. There is a chapter, we really had long discussions about what does it mean today, crowdsourcing. I mean, I think we as I think I can speak of a representative sample of humanitarian workers, UN and NGOs, and MSF was also with it, that we said, okay, this is a reality, and this is good news. The good news is that today, a family who is in a conflict area, say in Misrata, when it was in Libya, and there is bombardment and so on, they can really kind of directly engage with an outside agency, humanitarian agency, inform them of what's happening and so on. And with the help of the crowdsourcing and so on, one can then maybe also establish mappings. But behind, of course, there are tremendous also ethical dilemmas of manipulation, because, of course, this field, in a conflict, one has to remind, and Syria is a good example. I mean, it's tremendous manipulation. And, of course, all these means can also be manipulated. You can have then a massive mail from one community, and you are misled because you think, okay, the problem is there, and not. So one has to have a lot of mitigating factors, and one has to. I think we have to give ourselves the means really to be very smart, and also then, of course, in the field we have to inform people about the dangers, because oftentimes if you give. If you give innocently your name and say, well, I was raped, and the name goes somewhere which it should not go, then you have a responsibility. I mean, I think there is really a very strong responsibility of the agencies to broadly inform and to have a good, also proper sense of the problematics.
And then I'll take yours as well.
Okay, my last question is obviously, I think, one that has been asked before, but I would like it answering here in this context. Being a medical student, when we talk about protection, I think about the protection of aid workers. And I just wanted to hear the panel's response to whether they think increasingly it is becoming more insecure to be an aid worker, and if aid organisations are letting down their staff in that respect.
Norah.
Well, I had to choose this afternoon, like a lot of us had, which panel to go to. And I did go to the panel where it talked about the safety. Well, it was Protect the Protectors. So the title alone intrigued me. And I don't know if you were there, Jonathan, but there was a discussion. I mean, there's so to answer your question, is it more insecure? I don't have all the data in my head, but what I recall, and I wasn't there at the very beginning of it, is that clearly working inside war zones is still actually relatively I can no longer say relatively new, but it was not something we did traditionally. I explained that I started in 1980 on the Thai-Cambodian border, but I was on the border. I was not working inside Cambodia when the genocide was happening. This, of course, is not true for organizations like ICRC and MSF that came into being during the crisis in Biafra in the 1960s. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, conflict zones are incredibly dangerous. Aid workers do lose lives. The majority of the lives lost are our national staff. Do aid agencies, do humanitarian agencies put enough of effort into safeguarding their staff? I guess it varies. I think the discussion nowadays, as I understand it, is more about are we becoming risk averse and pushing too much onto national staff and to remote management models of trying to be of help. So, yeah, I mean, it's very expensive to, when I worked in Afghanistan, to have someone like me there. We lived kind of in somewhat bunkered accommodation. Because I was working in the UN and working in UNAMA, I actually was able to get out and about probably more easily than a lot of NGO staff. When I arrived back in Afghanistan into 2007, most NGO staff had withdrawn from Kandahar and Helmand. MSF started in Helmand a few years later, partly as the war intensified, needs increased. But the point here is that I was able to move around because I had access to helicopters, so I didn't have to go by road, which is the most dangerous. And that apparently is what the data that came out of A.B. Stoddard is still in the room, that apparently it's roads that is more dangerous. What I didn't hear, though, in the discussion was, and working in Afghanistan, it's an ever-present thought, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Working in asymmetrical war environments, you can take as much precaution as you like, but if you do happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when a bomb goes off, then, yeah. To answer your question, Jonathan, but maybe other people in the room have different ideas. I think it's something we're very conscious of. It would be difficult not to be very conscious of it. I think the challenge more is how to address the threat while not then ending up in bunkers, where I think if we're not present, it's an engaging with the communities who are more at harm than someone like me, that's for sure, then the extent to which we can actually be effective. Maybe you want to ask a few questions. Maybe ask a few questions.
It's not so much a question, but it's something which really is very precious to my heart. First of all, if I was a pessimist, I would say it's really utopic what you're doing. But instead of competing each other, let's put the letter L and it becomes completing each other. So you can take that for love and light and whatever we want. But I would like to share a sentence that a great German woman once said, Louise Rinser. A young person entered a shop and he asked the shopkeeper, what do you sell? And the answer was, everything you want. So this young person says, then I would want the end of every war, no woman raped, no child ever be hungry, and that everybody would want to speak to each other instead of killing each other, so that there would be much more joy in this world. And the shopkeeper says, sorry, we don't sell fruit, but we definitely sell all the seeds. So would you kindly keep these seeds going on? And thank you ever so much for the great Congress.
Oh, thanks the organizers. It's a good way. We almost finished on this, but do you have a question? you don't have to be as lyrical. A question will do. But lyrical is good too. Go either way.
Daniel Norah is the name. I think that would have actually been a perfect way to close conference. No, my question would be rather on the nature of the relationship between the military, the human actors, and the UN. Do you feel there's a need for a change in this relationship? And if so, from whose side and in which direction? Thank you.
That's a straightforward question, which I think requires a very short answer.
The very short answer, I repeat what Peter Ocha was saying today also in our panel, that the military, they have to be military. They have to have the military approach. The military should not do humanitarian work. Maybe it's a little bit hard for the militaries, but I think this is what so that is also really my experience, because that creates all kind of problems. And militaries are meant to be really, they should do their job first, and then it would be already probably better. As we have heard from the general, if they get more resources and clearer mandates and so on, then it will be better, if I understood you well.
Well, simplistic is good as far as I'm concerned, because we've got to conclude. And Norah, do you want to give us a very brief answer? If not, don't worry, you don't have to.
No. I obviously, well, relationships evolve, and in principle, we're supposed to be learning from experience, and there's different types of missions and different types of environments. Do the relationships have to change? Absolutely. Very quickly on Afghanistan, I was part of a political mission that was seen as very one-sided, because it was very partisan, in other words, because it was there to, in principle, build the capacity of the country, in other words, work with the government. But I, as heading up a human rights team, was able to argue in and outside the mission that if we were going to give attention to human rights, and the work we did on civilian casualties was done within a humanitarian context, that we had to work cross lines, cross border, and everything else. So the point is, it was possible to carve out and insulate the space inside the mission, but more importantly, it was also possible to be able to interact with senior and less senior people in the armed opposition with a focus on protection of civilians. So the point here is clearly relations have to improve, but I also think it's more complex than it's sometimes presented. That it was, notwithstanding lots of issues, it was still possible in Afghanistan to talk across lines while still being part of UNAMA. And lessons should be learned from that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to our panelists. Please join me in thanking them. And thank you to the organizers of the conference. And thank you for being here quite late on a Saturday afternoon. So thank you very much.